Bob Mueller's first criminal trial in the Russia probe, and what may now be today the worst day for Paul Manafort yet. He does face the potential of an effective life sentence on those charges of bank fraud and tax fraud. And after 2 weeks of evidence from Mueller and 27 witnesses, today was going to be the day that everyone started to hear the other side. When we cover trials, the beginning is usually tougher for the defendant because prosecutors lay out their evidence. We hear from the star witnesses, all the worst things that prosecutors found, whether it be from surveillance or from a home raid or from other people, all of that piles up. And then today in this trial would be the day the defense steps up and starts poking holes in the case. And today, Paul Manafort's defense team didn't do that. Instead, they rested without calling a single witness, not one. And as we've reported, they rested without Manafort taking the stand either. Now, today, the court heard directly from him for the very first time. Judge Ellis called him up to the podium. This is a ritual familiar to anyone in court to confirm that the defendant understood that he, Paul Manafort, has a right to testify. And the judge asked Manafort, who of course does hold a law degree, if he'd made a decision about that right. And today, Manafort rose and told Judge Ellis, "I have decided, Your Honor." And the judge, going through this formal process, says, "Do you wish to testify?" And Paul Manafort responded and said, "No, sir." And today, Paul Manafort said, his lawyer said that Paul Manafort's strategy for all this is quite simple. They don't think they need a major rebuttal. They don't think they need to testify because they're arguing that Bob Mueller, who in the quote you're about to see is referred to technically as the government, has not put up enough evidence.
Mr. Manafort just rested his case, and he did so because he and his legal team believe that the government has not met its burden of proof.
In the U.S. legal system, nothing negative is automatically inferred from the defense declining to introduce evidence or from a defendant declining to take the stand. Those are their rights precisely because the entire burden here is on Mueller and his prosecutors to prove their case. That's the burden on the government. But then when you get into the details in this case, Mueller's team argues they have achieved that through their star witness, Rick Gates, through a mountain of other evidence, and through other corroborating witnesses who were granted a type of use immunity to say, yep, we helped Manafort commit these crimes. So here we are. Tomorrow is the ninth inning of this trial. Closing statements, and then the jury deliberates and decides. There's only a few things left that we don't know. A little one that could get bigger is we don't know why the judge met privately with the jury for 2 hours today. All kinds of speculation about that sort of thing. And the other one is that, of course, as always, we don't know what this jury will do with the evidence they have been presented. But Paul Manafort's judgment day is coming. Is he looking for some salvation outside of this courtroom that might only come from a presidential pardon? I turn now to Maya Wiley, a former counsel to the mayor of New York City and someone familiar with these kind of cases, a former Watergate special prosecutor Nick Ackerman, and E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post. Maya, when you look at this decision, which, as I say carefully, is not something we infer anything legally negative about, but which does look dumb given the overwhelming evidence, how do you interpret it?
I interpret it as the defense doesn't have a defense. At the end of the day, what we have are a series of witnesses, even before you get to Rick Gates, two accountants and a bookkeeper who literally went through a process with documents of saying false document, supported a false statement, including false statements to the IRS, but also to banks in terms of what loans they were trying to get for Manafort in order to pay and sustain his very expensive lifestyle. You have emails from Paul Manafort himself saying he did not have foreign bank accounts, right? So it's not even just a credibility question, because unless you can mount a defense that says those folks are lying or shouldn't be believed, or the documents themselves that are before you have been falsified or can be interpreted in a different way, you've essentially said you don't have a defense.
Well, let me push you. That's a factual evidence issue, as you mentioned. Correct. That they have a lot of trouble with the facts on the books. But what about calling up witnesses to try to say deep state, to try to say 13 angry Democrats, to try to have somebody make the case that's been made out of the courtroom in some way, even if it's thin? They didn't even do that.
They didn't even do that, and Look, I don't think that would have been a winning defense, but to your point, either they, I think they had to worry a lot about what a prosecution could say going after what evidence or whatever witnesses they would pull forward to bring that. So, remember that the prosecution would get a rebuttal process. They could cross-examine whatever was put on. And I think when you start to do something that looks to a jury like you're grasping at straws, it doesn't actually strengthen your case.
Oh, I think it'd be much worse. I mean, they've really got them coming and going here. The real issue is one of intent and criminal intent, because in a tax case, you have to show that somebody intended to cheat on their taxes. Well, they've got him doing that in multiple years, understating his taxes in a series of years. But then even worse, they've got him doing just the opposite when he no longer has any money and he needs to go out and steal it from the banks by getting all of these phony bank loans, when he has to overstate what his income is. So if ever there was a slam dunk case of intent, you've got it between, he's been whipsawed between the taxes and the bank fraud.
Well, you just walked through it. Let's go into detail. We'll put up on the screen. You're talking about the false income tax returns, of which there's a lot of material that the prosecutors put forward to prove that. The failing to report foreign bank accounts, which is fairly easy to prove if you can show that the bank accounts existed under his name, as Maya was mentioning. And then, of course, the 9 counts of bank fraud. Do you think these are all likely to come back guilty, Nick?
Oh, I'd be shocked if they didn't, because they're not only confirmed by what Rick Gates said, but they're all confirmed by what Manafort said. He said it in emails, he said it in memos, he instructed his accountants what to do, he instructed his lawyers what to do. I mean, it is probably the strongest tax case I have ever seen, and I've prosecuted a lot of tax cases. I mean, this is pretty amazing.
What makes it stronger? All the extra talking witnesses?
Well, you've got the talking witnesses, you've got tons of documents. I mean, this is all documented straight from Cyprus into his bank accounts, into his tax returns. You've got the fact that he didn't check off that he had these foreign accounts. You've got it's the documents that actually bury him here. It's his own words in those documents. It's the tracing of the money from Ukraine through Cyprus back to the U.S. onto his tax returns where it doesn't exist. And then you see what he does when he stops making all of this money in the Ukraine. He winds up then having to phony up bank loans by inflating his income. So doing it both ways, and the documents showing it both ways, and then you've got the summary evidence from the agents that the jury's going to be able to take those charts into the jury room. Mm-hmm. This is not going to be a long deliberation.
Well, you think it's not going to be a long deliberation, Maya. Let's dig into that, which is you do get holdouts on juries. Juries are people. And so sometimes you have 1 or 2 people who kind of say, well, I don't know. I don't buy it. They're the hardest ones to reason with if they're just big picture. I'm not so sure. I have reasonable doubt. Walk us through what you would expect the prosecutors hope jurors will do in that jury room with the evidence, because someone who is speaking vaguely with reasonable doubt is going to have to reason with a room full of people saying, but look at these tax forms.
Well, so I think Nick is making really important points, particularly on the tax fraud counts, because you actually have documents that where Manafort lied, right? It lied because we know that there are other facts about, falsifying documents, knowing they were falsified. His own bookkeeper and accountants not knowing that he had these foreign accounts, and having been directly asked whether he had them and being told in multiple years, you have to tell us if you do. It's very hard for anyone to argue then, to Nick's point, that there is, so that's what a juror, if there is a holdout juror, would have to confront. It's not just about Rick Gates' credibility, because there's too much that Manafort himself has done. I think that and I agree generally this is a very strong case. I'd be very surprised if there aren't a whole lot of guilty counts that come out of this. I will say that there are some counts I could imagine some debate on. I think the Federal Savings Bank, where there's a question, where a juror could raise a factual question about whether the prosecution demonstrated sufficiently that the bank relied on false statements in order to make the loans.
Because it becomes a what would they have done?
What would they have done? And so that's where I think the judge did the right thing by saying that's a question for the jury. I'm not going to throw these counts out.
EJ, I want to go to the Jared Kushner of it all, because one of the things that people around Manafort have said is, well, okay, maybe he was a crook, but he was a crook before 2016. He was removed from the campaign. And so what's the big deal? And then you have the evidence that's come up here that I'll read to you, where Manafort was explicitly trying to push one of his bankers into Secretary of the Army, an important position. This was after receiving the beginning of a $16 million loan, and pushed it on Jared Kushner, who said, okay, I'm on it. Now, the prosecutors are not alleging that Jared Kushner knew that this was a kind of a payoff in Manafort's mind, although that is the implication, which means even if you didn't catch it, that's really bad as a way to staff the Army, no?
No, I mean, I think that part of the case is another episode of how the administration is kind of grifter city, because here you have Manafort trying to get a loan when he doesn't really have the financial situation that justifies it. So he goes to the chairman of the bank, creates this relationship, and then clearly tries to help him get a job in the administration, writes a memo saying he'll advance DT's agenda. Now, ironically, I think the defense will try to use that to say, well, there's nothing fraudulent here. The chairman of the bank approved the loan. And that's why I agree with Maya that in all of this, I think the bank charges may be the ones where he may get some acquittals. But if I could, I think the defense is relying on two things. One is they eviscerated Rick Gates. They ran what amounts to a negative campaign against him, hoping to catch a juror or two saying, well, yeah, there's all this paper evidence, but can you believe this guy Gates? So it's almost classic Trump campaign. Don't look at me, look at the guy who is against me. The other is that Judge Lewis made a lot of side comments. He was almost like an opinion columnist at times that were not very kind to the prosecution.
Aren't you an opinion columnist, EJ?
And I am an opinion. Maybe he can join this profession instead of that one. But I think that they are hoping that some of those side comments might have gotten to the jury and, again, might create some doubt in their minds that would lead them to an acquittal, even though, as my colleagues have said, the evidence is really powerful here.
Well, I think you make an astute legal point, which is that juries are often impacted by the tone and the mood, and the judge has a very special type of authority in that room. And so some of his withering distaste for things the prosecutors were doing don't legally mean that the jurors should find guilt or not guilt, but rather he was annoyed with them, and it's a multi-week process, and a court is also an office place, a workplace like any other, where people sometimes get short-tempered. As for the big question, Maya, take a look at President Trump when he was asked about a potential pardon for Manafort.
Would you pardon Paul Manafort?
I haven't even thought about it.
What about Michael Cohen?
I haven't thought about any of it.
But you're not ruling it out?
Certainly, it's far too early to be thinking about that.
But you're not going to
Do you
rule
think
it
the
out?
presidential framers envisioned it? Haven't been convicted of anything. There's nothing to pardon. It's far too
If
early
it
to
came to that.
It is far too early to be thinking about it.
That was June, and it was true in the traditional pardon process. It would be too early. Most people don't use preemptive pardons, although the Supreme Court has upheld them. But it's not going to be too early soon if this jury goes in a certain direction. Do you think that Paul Manafort's defense reflects some Hail Mary hope for a pardon?
Absolutely. First of all, Donald Trump has signaled in multiple ways that he would very seriously consider pardoning Paul Manafort, one by some of the other people he has pardoned, Dinesh D'Souza, to name a few, Joe Arpaio.
Scooter Libby.
Scooter Libby.
For obstruction.
For obstruction. So what he has done is set a trail of pardons that can only indicate to anyone caught up in this investigation and who may face charges that he will protect them as long as they don't turn on him. I think we've seen that play out in multiple ways with other people. So what I think now Paul Manafort has a problem with the pardon, even if he gets it, which is that state attorneys general may have criminal charges they might be able to bring for some of these transactions depending on the state. So it's not to say that he doesn't have some exposure, but I don't think there's any question that he must be hoping for this, because I can't figure out any other reason why we haven't either seen a deal, a plea deal,
right,
or some more significant defense mounted in this trial.
And Nick, if he got a federal pardon, it would deal with this case and potentially moot the D.C. prosecution, but leave him open to to state
Right. I
prosecution.
mean, he still would be open to money laundering charges in other states where the money passed through. I mean, in some instances, it could be even more serious than what he's facing on the federal side.
Well, and you have to wonder, depending on the states, if he was hiding all that money from federal taxes, was he then going and carefully paying all the state taxes?
Oh, I'm
That's
sure he
right.
wasn't.
Doesn't appear so.
No way.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.